Yeah, you are. We're
So
live.
clear, nice and
FYI.
loud.
You're the
Lots.
only one that sounds great. Yeah.
All right, we're live, boys, with the Mandibles Bitcoiner Book Club. Whoop whoop.
Whoop,
Woohoo.
whoop.
This was a long time
So
coming, it feels like.
yeah, well, I mean, I didn't realize until a couple of days ago that the book came out in 2016,
Yeah.
and I'd heard like people make some noise about it. I think a year or two ago, and I have a pretty strong aversion to fiction, so I just didn't go down the rabbit hole. But everyone kept talking it up over the last few weeks, and Odell, you were pretty enthusiastic about it, so I gave it a read, and obviously I can see why it resonates with the current times we're in, and especially Bitcoiners. So, I mean, how do you want to get this kicked off? Does everyone want to do like a really brief, like, this is who I
basically written
am?
for us.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say that like we should give the author a little bit. Like the only issue with this book to me is the lack of Bitcoin. And she had like a single sentence. She was like, "Oh, remember that Bitcoin thing? Like it didn't work out." But 2016, you write it in 2016 to think that Bitcoin. I mean, we didn't think Bitcoin was going to fail, but
Yeah.
it was a question mark at the time.
Somebody brought up a good point on Twitter the other day. They were saying that somebody had said, "Oh, this bear market is the first bear market where people there's no question that Bitcoin is going to continue being around." But somebody else said, "Well, all the Bitcoiners that stuck around through the bear market, like nobody had any question whether it was going to stick around and survive and continue." Like the sentiment in a fair number of people was, okay, well, we're just in a bear market. But after the 2013 pop, which would have been in the midst of writing this book, there was still question around, is it coming back for a lot of people? So yeah, you're right. Like you can't really fault her for, this being published in 2016, probably written through 2015, saying like, well, maybe it wasn't a thing.
And to her credit, she actually wrote a follow-up she's written a number of economic essays since the publication of the book, but she did write one in particular, I think in like 2020, that was saying, hey, look, cryptocurrency is basically our only way out. And so we should be really supportive of it. I don't think she's gotten Bitcoin per se, but I think she's probably, realizing that cryptocurrency is the only kind of hope we have to avoid the outcome of the book.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if the book was written a year or two even later, how the narrative would have changed. But like one of the things I found interesting about the book, and one of my major takeaways was one, I listened to a few interviews that she did afterwards, and she said she wanted to write a dystopian novel, but that was like way closer in time than is often the case, right? Oftentimes it's like 50 or 100 years ahead, and she wanted to just be like a little bump ahead. And, we can all share what our takeaways were, but one of the ones that struck me the most was just like, we read this, right? And we're like, wow, like that's bad. And we also seem to be on that course. Like we can easily make the connections to things that are articulated in the book and things that are happening today. And, it's a pretty straight line from where we are today to some of the things that happen. But, for many people in the world today, let's just use the States as an example, like that's current time. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to do like a big social justice thing here, but you look at San Francisco and look at Philly and look at, Chicago, and look at all these places where that sequence of events where the changing, economic foundation has kicked people out of an ability to contend with it. And they have already gone down that road of family living together, not having any savings, inflation eroding their purchasing power, being kicked out of their homes, being forced to prostitution, crime, etc. Like that's reality for a fucking gigantic portion of people today. And like we can all we can all tolerate it, right? Like we have more wiggle room, because we're in a different socioeconomic strata. And so we look at it and be like, boy, like we're kind of anticipating things getting that bad and hoping that we can build something in parallel that allows more people to escape. But it's like, it's not set in the future for a lot of people, I guess is the point I'm making.
Well, when they're talking about, I guess the contextualizing like when and what has happened in the beginning of the book, it starts in 2029, but in 2024 there had been like a mass blackout of like the entire US grid, and everything went down, and it caused all these massive issues with their infrastructure and all that. And so they were still kind of reeling from that. And then you get dumped into this, the supposed recovery from that before all of this economic shit hits with the Bangor replacing the dollar and all that. So it feels very reminiscent of the rumblings that we'll hear. Oh, the the preps that we see for, oh, there's going to be online infrastructure attacks, things like that.
Cyber pandemic.
Yeah, cyber pandemic. That's the word I was looking for, right? Like it seems very similar to that kind of narrative playing out in this book. And yeah, I don't know. Do we think that's on the docket? Do you think if that were to happen, we see a similar outcome to this book?
The way I look at it with this book is, first of all, I mean, she was insanely prescient in terms of writing it in 2016. I think a lot of people would disagree with her takes in 2016 that wouldn't necessarily disagree with it today. But I look at it from like 2 points of view. Well, first of all, I thought it was interesting, John, that you said that you don't like fiction. I base all of my life decisions on the lessons I've learned in science fiction novels. So I guess we're different sides of the coin there. Right? But the way I look at this book is it's two sides. It's first, people should assume that this is the trajectory you're going into, and they should take they should make personal decisions today to try and prepare themselves to be better suited for that situation. But then also as a greater Bitcoin community and people that are, really tuned in on this kind of issue and these kind of concerns, try and make it so that she is wrong. Right. So it's twofold. It's protecting yourself, but also, maybe this doesn't have to be the trajectory that we're going in.
Yeah. I mean, that's go ahead, guy.
Oh, I was just going to say one thing that kind of stood out to me, and it's been almost a year since I listened to the book. I'll need like kind of a little refresher if y'all end up talking about some specific thing, if anybody can drop context for a reminder. But what I remember being like kind of shocked about, and of course this was during the height of lockdowns and stuff, was how not unbelievable most of the things that were happening was. Like how many things were relatable, how many things were discussions like towards the beginning there were like it was constant news reports about the bond markets and interest rates and stuff, and like we're kind of seeing so many of exactly those sorts of things, like we're watching interest rates spike right now, and then basically have to respond to this. And there were like little comments about like the dollar is only like 40% of the world reserve now, etc. Like you're just seeing like these little like pieces of the puzzle, and I remembered specifically, just because it wore on me so bad, was the opening, The Economist. And I wanted to scream at that guy, like during his like monologue towards the beginning there, of just like gold is outdated and everybody's so stupid. It's all about confidence. And it's so funny because like I have these conversations, like this is like this is exactly what they think. And of course, as things get absolutely horrible and we're 90% down from where we are, they still believe the same thing. It's like, oh, it's just because everybody lost confidence, and it's all just a game of appearance. But it was just it was surprising to me how many things were lining up with 2020, and we were rationing toilet paper, and they're talking about rationing paper towels. One roll has to last so many weeks or whatever it was. And it was just like, shit, man, good God, it's amazing how fast this could move in that direction.
Can we talk about the one quote from the Economist's uncle, I think, Lowell. Yeah. He talks about the like volatility of he refers to gold and he says, he's like, oh, gold always ping-ponging all over the place, which is such a hilarious, comparison to like the Weimar price of gold as it's going through hyperinflation, like saying it's basically, oh, it's so unreliable, it's all over the place. How do you price it? And then he's talking about like the hedge funds overseas that are like getting rid of their dollar position and moving into gold. And, you have like, it's obvious that Shriver was, recognized the value of sound money, but she talks about gold, how a lot of people refer to Bitcoin nowadays. And they talk about, oh, gold, in the book, it had almost no intrinsic, like there's no actual use cases for it because it had been replaced by other things. It wasn't used in electronics anymore. And so they looked at that as like a bad thing. The Economist was like, well, it has no other use cases, so it's even worse now when, Bitcoiners say, having other use cases outside of a use case of money kind of, it distorts the signal of that monetary premium. So yeah.
What's interesting about this book and her treatment of the characters, which I think she did really well, is like Guy was saying, like we interact with those economists, those Lowell types, like all the fucking time on Twitter. And I'm sure all of us on like in this discussion identify with Willing, right? We're like, yeah, that motherfucker, like he's not credentialed or whatever, but he's paying attention and he knows and he's studious and like he's rational. And I'm sure we're all
straight up a Bitcoiner.
Right. But imagine reading that book, not being one of us. Like if you were a normie, quote unquote, like would you have identified the rational position with the Economist guy and been like nodding your head when he was like straighting Willing out and like putting him in his place? That's we all just like, we probably all read that book through the lens or the perspective of Willing, right? And when shit hits the fan and he's looking to go to Nevada, we're like, yeah, fuck, dude, go to the free state, like, start over and all that shit. But like, how would someone who doesn't have our understanding or who has a different perspective on how things are unfolding have read that book? Like, how would it have impacted?
I can tell you right now, because there's a Vox article reviewing it in 2016, and the title is awesome. Lionel Shriver's The Mandibles is the smuggest dystopian novel this side of Ayn Rand. That's how you would read it as a normie.
Right. But I mean, that's what makes it interesting too. Like how it makes you feel. Like for me, I think Matt said that, I don't know if we were on live yet or not, but like it made me feel kind of down inside, like at least at a certain part. Cause like it made it real enough to have it be believable. And then, I really wonder how well this book, or like what the sales were like pre and post pandemic. Cause like even that toilet paper remark, like when shit first popped off in March or April of 2020, I don't know what the case was where you guys were, but in Canada, like there was a scramble for toilet paper and there was a shortage. Now it was entirely because people were just retarded and they were like, they heard about a toilet paper shortage. So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy and they went ham on toilet paper. And, for a few days there was none, but like the events of the last 2 years have made like this book so much more like salient, I guess. And, one of the things that I would like to do with it, is hand it off to people that I've been trying to make this case for, for Bitcoin and for what may unfold if we're not proactive with things, hand it off to them and see what it conjures up in them. Like, does it conjure up any more? Does it make it more real to them? And does it make them more receptive to maybe be more proactive in mitigating the damages that might be on the horizon?
To go back to the idea of Willing as a Bitcoiner, I might actually, just for the sake of argument, I might disagree with that, because Willing throughout the book. Okay, so maybe we should kind of walk through the structure of the family just to set the context for who is what, because I think one of the huge values of the book is that the Mandibles as a family kind of encompasses the whole socioeconomic strata. I mean, there's nobody who's like destitute in there, but Douglas, the grandfather, is kind of an older sort of based. He's sort of the patriarch of the family, and he's 97 years old, and has, before the crisis, basically had, I think he had some commodities, some gold, some stocks. Like he was pretty diversified, but because it was all on paper, he winds up essentially destitute once inflation gets going, because there are bail-ins, the government confiscates everything. So he's kind of the patriarch. His son Carter Mandible was married to Florence, and Florence
He was married
Jane.
to
to Jane. Okay, right.
and then
married.
Luella was the replacement.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Florence's family is interesting because they're kind of like the closest to working class here. She's married to a guy named Esteban, who's, I think, like a laborer. And that's where Willing fits in. Willing is the son of Florence, and Willing's a very interesting character. He's basically the protagonist. And what's interesting about Willing is that he's almost perfectly adapted for this situation where paper wealth completely disappears. There are huge physical, shortages, and the family basically has to start ruthlessly stripping back their consumption, farming food. At some point, Willing takes up the gun. So Willing as a Bitcoiner is kind of an interesting proposition, because what was so impactful for me reading this book is this idea that in a true inflationary collapse, like, there might be this intervening period of time where nothing is worth anything unless it's sort of an immediately consumable physical commodity or a tool or, a skill set like plumbing or, electrical work. And Willing, to me, kind of typifies this primitive character that is capable of all those things, is capable of relaxing his morality to hold somebody up or kill somebody to sort of survive. I think if you were going to pick a Bitcoiner, I would almost pick Noli, who's the sister from Paris, who's the writer. I don't want to necessarily spoil the book, but she sort of saves the family in a way that I think many Bitcoiners could relate to.
That's a good point. And she was very under the radar until the time was right to, show her hand, basically.
Right.
I mean, I just want to say to anyone who's listening, I think there's going to be many spoilers. So if you haven't read the book, stop listening now.
Yeah.
Go read the book
hard.
and then come back.
It's hard to talk about it when the best things are all spoilers.
Yeah.
I think Douglas you could make a case that, he was kind of Bitcoiner-esque as well. I mean, he was the most well-positioned, and then he was also so accepting of the circumstances, and he was always calm amidst them. And then, of course, his final act was pretty fucking intense / badass, and very selfless.
Mm-hmm.
So,
they're
Totally.
all a bunch of Peter Schiffs that were right in an instance where Bitcoin didn't work out, right? Like that's.
I think that's right, Sessions. I think he's the perfect example. He's like a sort of optimistic Peter Schiff, where he kind of understood the fundamentals of everything, and he kind of got at everything, and he tried to position himself, but he just didn't do it the right way, and got completely wiped out.
Yeah.
How did the book make you guys feel? I said it. There were times where I think in the middle, it was
The middle was
somewhat
depressing as fuck.
Yeah.
She saved the book by doing something that's probably controversial in author land, which is she jumped ahead 15 years or so at the end. But to me, it was like the book is mainly the beginning and the end. The middle part is just almost rubbing it in that they just weren't prepared for that situation at all. It was just a bunch of chapters of just rubbing it in, how bad it can really get if you're not prepared or not thinking about these things.
Yeah. Well, there are so many awful things. They literally get house-jacked. Their neighbors come over and they're like, all right, get the fuck out. We've got a gun and you don't. That was, and that was, again, they talk about, they refer to guns in the Second Amendment a couple times throughout this, and the parents don't want a weapon in the house, and Willing is understands that it's now time to make sure you can protect yourself. But in the end, they get screwed because the neighbors come over and basically just add gunpoint and say, get the hell out of your own house. But then later on in the book, like during that leap forward, they refer to a lot of things that have happened in the past. And one of them is that experts have gone and reinterpreted the Second Amendment, and they interpret a well-armed militia or something like that as what's meant to be armies and police forces, not individuals. And so they basically revoke, or again, reinterpret the Second Amendment so that nobody can defend themselves anymore.
But yeah, I think I'm sorry, John.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think the middle part of that book, where it's just a grind of circumstances getting worse and worse and worse so steadily, is like the most important aspect of the book, because we spend a lot of time in this world of like ungrounded abstractions like dysfunctional treasury markets and CPI, and this book is really, really important to me because it's kind of a visceral reminder of what an inflationary collapse actually looks like, and how that's a much less orderly process than we think about it being.
Right. The grind isn't glamorous. And I mean, one thing I learned in 2020 was, Bitcoiners, 2020 was super weird for us, right? Because Bitcoiners were kind of on the leading edge in terms of being worried about COVID. We were like stocking up on supplies and stuff. And then we flipped before everyone else in terms of saying that people are being ridiculous and you got to live your lives, that there's too much government overreach. But besides all of that, one of the things I took away from 2020 is, and this is also what people learn when they trade shitcoins, right? Is that when you're down like 85%, you can easily go down another 85% slowly, right? So you get to this point where you're like, we already fucked up, we weren't prepared, like there's no solving the situation. But really, if you put your pedal to the metal and you start thinking about it and trying to be pragmatic, you can avoid the further losses, the further tragedy, if you don't just like settle in, right? And they ended up in this book, they settled in, right? There was a lot of trauma and tragedy that happened there. If instead of settling in, they decided to leave New York City earlier and go to, ironically enough, their relative's ranch that was called the Citadel.
That's right. Jared, the brother of Carter Mandible, I think,
he was really the Bitcoiner.
Maybe he's the Bitcoiner.
Yeah, that could be.
He was already there.
I want an episode of Citadel Hunter at Jared's ranch.
I think that was so good. I think it's a good point though about how the book displays the grinding, like the slow grind of winding up in a different situation. And I've seen that in family and friends' lives over the course of the last 2 years. And unsurprisingly, like Shriver has said, had I, because so many things that she, the chipping and the tracking and all that stuff in that book, the last 2 years, a lot of that stuff has become real in a very similar way. And the money printing and the inflation. And of course, in hindsight, she said, if I knew what was going to happen in the intervening, 2020, from 2020 to 2022, I would have pushed the timeline forward. But she was obviously very prescient in being able to anticipate what would happen here. But one of the things the reason why it was depressing for me was because it kind of showed how this slow, you always think the big, scary life events are going to be easily demarcated. I just need to keep my eye out for this and I'll be fine. But really, it's just a slow grind where every day you just you give a little, you accept a little, you don't push back, you don't speak up, you just keep going. You think it's going to revert to the mean, you think it's going to go back to normal. And then 5-10 years down the road, you've just been grinded down so much that you didn't even realize when you gave up. Yeah. You just completely submitted, and you wind up in a place where once you wake up and you realize that, well, then desperate behavior is the only thing left available to you, whether it's prostitution, armed robbery, living on the street, whatever. Like, it's just that slow, like, grinding of your soul down until you're no longer really able, financially or energetically, spiritually, whatever, to get out of that situation. And that was very evident in the storyline to me. And I think that's true. Like, I think that's very real. And if you just look at the last 2 years, so many people, maybe outside of Bitcoin, there's that rationalizing, there's that, it'll go back, or no, it's actually good, and all of this kind of stuff. And I think if you zoom out, you see that that's like the process of being ground down until you wake up one day and you don't have the capacity to build yourself back up. And I also think that's why this book is kind of, there's a lot to be made. I think Elon tweeted out that left, right, me sort of meme the other day, where the left has, a lot of us haven't moved, but the left has gone that way, or at least that was his assertion. And I think that, this book is kind of emblematic of that, where the circumstances changed so much that people became more quote unquote extreme, or more anarchy oriented, or more freedom or libertarian oriented, just by virtue of the dramatically changing circumstance. And I think, again, in terms of how this book might open people's eyes to a potential future, I think it might help them see how their perspective on politics, or that left-right divide, might change based on the changing circumstance. How one side might become more extreme.
The other aspect to it was the willful ignorance or apathy towards even understanding what was going on. Like, at the very beginning of the book, it's already really dire. Like, the Florence girl and Willing, they're living basically in hovels, right? They're in a terrible situation already. And Willing's watching, he's asking these questions like, what's a reserve currency, as he's watching the news. And his mom is like, I used to pay attention to that kind of stuff, and I don't know. I don't care anymore. I whatever. Like, they've already gone through so much, and they've refused to even attempt to understand this mechanism that basically helps them value their time and their lives, and how it's being perverted and kind of stealing the fruits of their labor right out from under them. And then you also get this stubbornness of Lowell, right? Again, just refusing to believe in spite of everything happening around him, that he could have possibly been wrong about how the world works. And it's those were very, I don't know, they were very in your face when you have somebody like Willing that's curious and trying to learn the entire time and trying to actually figure out what's going on, versus the stubbornness of his uncle and the apathy of his mother.
I mean, that's an aspect that really hit me kind of hard, because I see it in the Bitcoin community, which is this situation where we get hounded by all this bullshit all the time. And then you have critical thinkers, then rather than try and sit down with the information and try and get information from as many sources as possible and deduct what's going on, you just turn off. You just say, all the news is fake news. This is all bullshit. Everything's a psyop. I'm not going to pay attention. And you can end up in this type of situation.
Yeah.
In what type of situation?
In what type of situation?
Yeah.
In the type of situation where you're blindsided by something that you don't necessarily need to be blindsided from.
Because
right,
there's out so much.
Because there's a willful ignorance, right? And in small doses, it's healthy. You shouldn't be constantly tuned in 24/7 to all this signal and all this noise. But at some point, you have to take some kind of personal responsibility and figure out what situation you're in, what is the real situation, how to best handle that situation. And I not only do I see that in the Bitcoin community, I see that all throughout my peer groups, even in normie circles or whatever, where they're just it's all bullshit. I just don't even pay attention to it. And if you're in that situation, you're basically just flying blind is what the result is. And you're operating under this assumption that if you do the right things or you do, good things, then the rest is just noise and doesn't matter to you. But ultimately we live in a society that's extremely interconnected, and what other people do will directly affect you.
I think a big part of that is that it's exhausting. It's exhausting. And I feel like people develop that apathy because you feel like you have absolutely no control over the situation. You're having to watch and listen to what other people do because they're literally in charge of your livelihood. And it becomes such a massive apparatus. And you see this in the breakdowns and explanations and personal accounts of other hyperinflationary events all over the place, is that people get apathetic, but then as things get worse and worse, you have less and less time to give a shit about what other people are saying or what other people are doing, because your whole life becomes your focus. It's like the ultimate short-term time preference, or a high time preference. And everything is just living day to day and getting the next roll of paper towels and making sure you have clean water. And the idea that you now that your life is now 10 times harder, and you have 10 times more shit that you have to listen to and worry about in boardrooms and Fed Reserve meetings and shit. Like, can you think about how powerless that makes somebody feel? Like, it's kind of like a degree of like, I'm going to have some control over my life if I just focus on the paper towels. And Odell, something that you brought up earlier is that this happened. There were so many stages of this when, gold is ping ponging, in the Weimar Republic, is that it would fall 85%, 90%. You'd have this horrible, 10x sort of collapse. And then this moment where things are slowing down and everybody would be like, oh God, that was horrible. I can't believe how bad it got, like it was over. And then you do twice that just after, people would rest thinking that was it. And now we're trying to figure out how to get back to normal, how to reverse this. And it had just started over and over and over again until you got to a point where it was so absurd that the ability to react to it was just gone. The ability to repair was just so left you so many times ago. That first respite was not the end of it. It was your chance to buy an extra roll of paper towels because you're going to be fucked in a couple of months. And how quickly these situations get out of hand, and they compound on each other because people aren't responding. People don't have the time to figure this shit out. And everything, it is a feedback loop, right? It is a negative feedback loop in every way. Your ability to pay attention to it, your ability to take command and control of your own life, the apathy that develops as a response to it. I just don't give a fuck about anything. The society is just falling apart and everybody's full of shit. I'm just going to deal with my own stuff. It is the deciviliization of society. When money falls apart, it all falls apart. Internally, externally, the whole fucking thing. And it's just crazy. This book did as awful as it was during the middle. It's not like it's not a true story in the sense of the reality of what happens in those situations.
So one of the most interesting and macabre parts of the book involve Lowell and Avery. So just to recap, Lowell is a college professor. He's sort of a classic Keynesian, and his wife Avery is some kind of a high-level woo therapist. And there's this really great scene where they have a dinner party and they invite various people over. One of the couples is a sort of modern monetary theory type ideology, and then there's, I think, some guy from the Treasury or some guy who's a federal marshal or something like that, who's kind of sort of a classic conservative. But this couple, I think, is particularly interesting because they're sort of the affluent older millennial couple. They have good jobs, their kids go to private schools and so forth, and you just see them completely disintegrate because in the course of this inflationary collapse, their skill sets are like mark to market in an interesting way, in that because of the fiat situation, they've been able to sort of make a really great living up until that point, doing these basically meaningless tasks. And when circumstances get dire, they don't have any kind of a real skill set to fall back on. And so they end up going very quickly to poverty, as they can't, meet their financial obligations, and can't make any money, because like there's just no demand for garbage once the the debt's flushed out of the system. And so for me, I mean, like it's an interesting challenge to me, because as Bitcoiners, I think we're kind of smug. We're like, oh yeah, we own Bitcoin, we're going to be fine, whatever happens. But all throughout reading this book, I think it was a really frightening read for me, because it became clear to me that that's not necessarily the case, and that there may be a period where there's significant physical scarcity, and what really matters is your ability to productively generate, kind of physical activity. And that's not just owning Bitcoin. Maybe that's, having some kind of a practical trade or skill under your belt. And so, to be honest, reading this scared the shit out of me, and it made me really want to look, no one's going to care in a hyperinflationary collapse if I can secure your computer network or audit your wallet. I mean, those considerations are so high level. It made me want to go, learn carpentry, do some more of that, or like learn how to work on a breaker box or something, because when things get dire, I just think there's going to be a period of time where the high level stuff goes out the window.
Electrical, mechanic, carpentry, like all that stuff, basic handyman shit, like just the ability, like so many people band-aid over problems by just replacing things very quickly. Like if something breaks, they don't know how to fix it. They literally just go buy the replacement and throw it away. They throw away like 90% of a working product because, just a couple of percent here on the edge broke. And if you can, get the component or whatever and fix the thing, that's insanely valuable in a world that's falling apart, when there's no supply chains and the ability to go buy the product just doesn't exist anymore. But yeah.
I mean, I want to unpack this a little bit, because like, obviously as a Bitcoiner, there's a glaring hole in this novel, which is that Bitcoin failed in like 2016 or 2018 or something, right before shit hit the fan. And basically I'm curious on your guys' opinions on, like, does Bitcoin prevent this situation? Does Bitcoin fix this, as so many people like to say, both on like a societal level, but also on like an individual, you hold Bitcoin, you're Bitcoin holder.
Well, why don't we go through a laundry list of the shit that went wrong, and then does Bitcoin fix this? Like I guess the government's reaction and kind of what they've done here.
At the surface level, I mean, the number one lesson that I would like most Bitcoiners to take away from this is the second shit hit the fan, they were going door to door seizing everybody's gold.
Yes.
So are most Bitcoiners prepared for that situation? I would say no.
No. The other thing, and this is they basically, again, they seize all the gold, but then they make any large local, or not local, but any miners, gold miners in the US can only sell to the treasury. And so does at-home Bitcoin mining or discrete Bitcoin mining on an individual basis fix that? Maybe.
Yeah, I think James' point was also very good, but also why so many Bitcoiners seem to be interested in regenerative agriculture, having a farm in the mountains, like ranching, that kind of thing, because I think they recognize that, sure, you can have your stack and the best money, ever. And that may, I mean, better to have it than not, right? But it may indeed be the case that money can't buy what you need, no matter what kind of money you have. And so being self-sufficient, like reducing your dependencies to the extent possible, is probably, a very wise move if we're heading into this type of environment. And Matt, to answer your question, I mean, I oscillate back and forth on this one. Whether like it can be avoided entirely, or I think I lean more towards something that happened in the book happening in real life, where there's a bifurcation and people go to the states or nations or jurisdictions where there's more freedom, less overbearing, government control. And that's like these little pockets of oasis where you can, if you have the means, you can go and you can live more freely. Now, then the question becomes like, what's the standoff between, the authoritarian jurisdictions and the ones that are more free, and, what happens there, who knows? But I think, I think that's probably where it's going to go in the short to medium term. And then, hopefully in the longer term, we switch systems and more people can be saved from this circumstance. But I think she was very prescient in adding that to the end of the book. And again, spoiler, but Nevada becomes a free state, and it's not so great. I mean, it's kind of eking out a survival. And I can't remember how long it had been free for when the boys, like when Willing and
what was it, 2042? They said they declared their freedom.
Right. And was it 2049 when the book
was
ended?
When they got there. Yeah.
So it's been on the go for 7 years. So fair enough. It wasn't like rocking it quite yet, but I feel like something like that is probably what's in the cards.
I mean, to me, what's crazy is just like how many check boxes she covered in terms of like my way of thinking when she wrote this book. Like I literally feel like she wrote the book for me, and it confirms most of my biases. I mean, she talks about surveillance. They have a chip. She's talking about seizing gold, banning cash, seizing farms. Farms got nationalized, right? They have basically a prepper uncle who has a place called a Citadel that he's like, we need to control our own food. She was like, even when they're going to Nevada, they like stop at basically like a rich prepper's bunker, like one of those really awesome bunkers that they sell, is what in my head is how I thought about it, where it's like 7 different levels and like an old missile silo, and like they're all dead and had a horrible life, which to me is kind of redeeming from the Bitcoiner side. Because a lot of times when I talk to people about these things, they're like, you're a crazy prepper person. And I'm like, no, I'm trying to be more pragmatic than that. Then I'm not going to just like seal myself in my missile bunker and expect to go out of it. But on one positive note, and I think we saw this in 2020, specifically as an American, is that international travel became an issue that got closed down really quickly. They're talking about later in the book, like which countries can they go to? No one wants to accept Americans. Like there's illegal immigration into Mexico. Even there's like a big wall that Mexico put up.
Mexico did pay for it,
but they could still drive coast to coast and switch jurisdictions internally within the United States, right? Which was a very powerful thing that I think Americans realized with our system in 2020, which is that we can easily do jurisdictional arbitrage within our federal boundaries.
Well, one of the worries about that is that the problem, is federal at this point, and there's so much. One of the smartest aspects of the book, I thought, is her emphasis. Like in the future, the healthcare sector is essentially like this, like UBI jobs program, where if you can't afford anything, you go work as a nurse or something. And, if you listen to Luke Groman, he talks a lot about this, like the fact that we can't print healthcare workers. And in reality, a lot of the sort of unfunded liabilities in America at the federal level are for healthcare. And so, I wonder, like, I love that we can switch jurisdictions to a certain extent and express preferences, for say New Hampshire or Texas over Maryland. But I wonder at one point that, that's kind of a minor point, and the federal situation comes home to roost.
Well, I think that's probably what creates those jurisdictions that break off or try to sequester themselves in some capacity. And maybe we're seeing the very beginnings of that in places like Texas and Florida and New Hampshire and stuff.
In the book, they talk about people trying to get into Nevada. They're talking about their chips that they have, and there's all this like rumor mill, probably started by the government itself, about like if you cross the border, it'll track you, and then it's basically self-destruct.
Blow your head.
Yeah, like that kind of. But again, like just everything that they can to prevent people from from using that jurisdictional arbitrage at that point. And there's so many again, things that Bitcoiners are like, oh yeah, that's a possibility down the line. To Matt's point, all of the things, like there's so many check boxes, like international currencies are illegal. The birth rate plummets because nobody can think long term and they don't want to have that extra expense. They talk about people on strike because they're only taking home 23% of their earnings. And the strikers are seen as unpatriotic. And then they're talking about his Goog is the one son, but his father, is it Lowell? Is that his father? Yeah, Lowell is his father. But he's going to be sitting pretty. He bought some stuff during the crash, and now he'll be able to sit on that. And Willing is like, really? He's going to be okay because 85% capital gains. And so they start going through all of this. They talk about how there's people that just the ways of escape, like bread and circuses kind of thing, like Walgreens, you can just go and buy heroin. They were out of Coke, so this guy buys heroin when they come to a dinner party. And then there's the people, the slumberers, the people that literally just like hook themselves up to a drum of industrial sludge food and like some narcotics to like put them out so they can just like sleep through their lives because they don't want reality. They save enough money for this drum of sludge to keep them alive and just go to sleep and just live as long as they can without having to interact with society. Like it gets
that's super dark. But I mean, just think that, I mean, I suspect something like that will inevitably be available. And I think it will probably be fairly popular.
Meta.
What if you're like, hey, yeah. I sorted out my investments and whatever else is going on in my life, I'd like to just drift through the next 5 years and let things happen and wake up in a better situation. I mean, how many people do you think would take that deal? I think a lot.
Well, a huge amount of people are going to do that.
I think or maybe not even slightly unrealistic.
Is this the metaverse?
Slumber might be a little bit, it's like kind of a basic premise of it, but I actually think like a lot of people will just like plug into like a VR reality, specifically if they can figure out how to make sex feel like sex. People are just going to like live out their lives completely plugged into the pod.
The real interesting question is, are they wrong to do that? Is it irrational to do that? Let's say that your physical environment and your life is just destitute, deprivation, stress, anxiety, all that stuff. And you have something available to you that's going to deliver the experience of greater abundance and greater happiness and greater all that. Like, is it irrational for you to plug yourself into the Matrix? I mean, this is the big metaphorical thing about Cypher in the actual movie, The Matrix, right?
Yeah. Well, and they talk about these slumberers as being like leeches on society. And, the guy who ends up basically working for the government and loves the taste of boot. Just he's talking about them as I don't know how they managed to save up some, but they as if it's a terrible thing that somebody managed to save up enough to escape the awful reality that is life in the US at that point. And they talk about them being a drain on society, but like if you think of the implications longer term of enough people doing that, society, like in order to get the electricity going to their house, there's got to be somebody living in the real world that's actually doing real work to keep the electrical grid going. Eventually it just folds in on itself if enough people go that route. And so is that assertion that they're kind of siphoning value from everybody else? I suppose at that point, because like there's nothing left. People have got to keep work to keep them asleep at that point. Until their body heat is used as the environmentally friendly method of powering fucking everything, exactly. Right? Yeah. But I mean, I kind of want to stay here for a second, because like, what is the rationale for not taking the easy road, basically, the more enticing experience? Like, what do you guys think is the rationale for staying in the real world?
Well, I mean, it's not I would push back a little bit in that, at least in this book, it's not a welfare mechanism. Like they're paying for it. They even say like they won't get woken up until
Totally.
their prepayments end. And ultimately, even though I disagree with necessarily doing that personally, I think people should be able to do whatever the fuck they want to do.
But why do you disagree with it is what I want to know.
I think ultimately it's a free will and control thing. And I think that pretty much however you cut those slices, in this case, it's a very simple thing. So it's slumber. So they're sleeping and they're dreaming, and it's just natural dreaming. When I think about where we go here is I think like proprietary walled gardens, virtual reality pods where like people are paying credits to corporations, and the corporations are spying on all their thoughts and, recording their memories and their dreams and everything that they're doing. So it's like purely a slavery thing. Like you're just this cattle that is in this pod that is paying them credits, which I expect to be sats. And that's just no way for a free man to live.
Well, and John, I think, to answer your question, for me personally, production ends up being a lot more fun than consumption ultimately. And I think long-term living a good life is doing things in the real world and producing things. And, you can't do that if you're spending all your day playing Xbox in your parents' basement, eating Taco Bell. And that's essential. I mean, that's the equivalent I see as this going to sleep thing, which I think we already have today. And if you look at family formation rates, there's pretty good indication that's widespread.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And yeah, I think you said like work is fun, but I accept that. But I think meaningfulness is also one of the aspects that you get from work that you don't necessarily get from consumption. But it does bring about an interesting question. Like if we arrive in a future where, because like when you're down in the basement with Taco Bell and video games, like you're just getting dopamine and whatever other, chemicals from all angles to make you feel good, right? The food and the game and the comfort of the couch and air conditioned room or whatever. And when that can be so specifically like titrated or delivered in like such precise amounts to deliver such precise experience, I mean, I think that question becomes even more like, well, why shouldn't I take the optimized experience, that can deliver it to me? And I think maybe this is why the development of technology might elicit greater consideration of the ineffable or spiritual realms of existence, because it brings you to the door to say like, okay, well, you can give me all the physiological pleasures that are available to me, but what can't you deliver to me? And why should I want the thing you can't deliver to me? And I think that's like a spiritual or theological discussion in some sense.
There's something there, meaning. Like it's the artificiality of it. I think like it's why do we all want girlfriends instead of just subscribing to OnlyFans? Right? It's sure you're being fed exactly what you ask for, but it's not, it's not real. Right. That's
a tricky line though. Where's the line between artificial and real?
Well, and that's the red pill, blue pill in the Matrix, right? Like, sure, do you want the wool pulled over your eyes and you'll just lead this happy existence? And some people can do that. Some people can subscribe to the OnlyFans and there's my girlfriend. And then other people want to go out and get on a date and interact and get genuine interaction. And they can't settle for the facade of everything being catered to what they want. They need it to be real. They need the experience of the ups and the downs with everything, instead of just this kind of bland, here you go, this is exactly as expected.
The truth,
it's like a drug addiction. Like, I mean, it really is.
Yep.
It's all of the fake endorphin response without any of the reason for it to be there. It's antidepressants, it's drug addiction, it's spending your life behind a video game or in a movie theater. Like the purpose, it's funny, like Odell and John, you were talking earlier about not liking fiction versus liking fiction. I am a huge fiction fan. I mean, I probably predominantly do nonfiction, but I genuinely think narrative is a better teacher than explanation. And I think you can learn more through valuable narrative, and Mandibles is a great example, actually, than you can by being explained something or told something. But in that same context is like, what's the purpose of the fiction? It's to learn something about what it's like to be human. And that's why it's unsatisfying when there's no struggle. That's why it's unsatisfying when there's no character arc to follow and nobody has learned anything in the story. You don't give a shit because you can't take anything away and think about your life and how things change. Like, there's no meaning in it. So for the same reason, if I just live day and night, like in a movie theater, just watching movies, well, I've defeated the purpose of watching movies. I've defeated the purpose of the whole task. And I'm just shooting up heroin so that I never have to think about when I'm having a bad day or a headache or whatever it is. I'm just always lost in this endorphin and everything is just meaningless. It's happiness without purpose.
Like, good fiction has a basis in reality. And this thought process, plugging yourself into a pod, going into sleep forever, does not actually have a basis in reality. It's just wasted mental cycles.
It's interesting, like someone like Peterson obviously goes to great lengths to describe how like religious narrative is hyper real because it's real across many different dimensions and scales and situations. And that's why, at least as far as I can tell, so many of them have been narrativized throughout time, and the narratives are what is carried through across time, because one, they can be remembered and transmitted across time, but also they retain their salience, like mapping on something that's extremely true and meaningful. And I think one of the answers to this question, like, well, why not stay in there all the time, is what you've all basically been saying. It's like, well, what value or meaning do you ascribe to truth to the extent that you can discern it? And I think, especially in Bitcoin, like a lot of us are like, we ascribe a lot of value and meaning on truth. Like maybe that's what we're all striving for, perhaps more than anything, is truth in every domain, truth in money and truth in, society, family, politics, food, fitness, health, whatever, truth seems to be the thing. And if you have a genuine allegiance or aspire toward perceiving greater truth, then jacking yourself into the matrix is basically the antithesis of that. But, and I think this is all a spectrum, right? Like nobody is exclusively on that end or exclusively on this, but you look around the world today, and at least it seems to me that most people are already in a lower tech version of this. Like James was saying about, the playing video games and Taco Bell in the basement, but like, I lived in Shanghai for a while, and for a while I was one of those miserable like office people that you wake up, you come out of your little box in a 40-story building, get on the subway with a bajillion other people for an hour, work, get on the subway, pick up some food on the way back, go up to your box, turn on Netflix, eat the food, go to bed, do it again for 5 days, shit-faced on the weekend, cover on Sunday, do it again. I mean, and like those people, that's mostly what they're doing. They're mediating their life by getting access to these like stimulating experiences or, releases, food and alcohol and, TV and all that stuff. And they're trying to create an artificial world to some extent to enable them to continue living the quote unquote real world. And, so if you're in that sort of a situation and someone offers you the ability to have less on the real and more on the artificial, I think an assessment of what's happening currently, you would have to kind of extrapolate and say a lot of people are going to take that deal, especially if they don't have such a reverence or dedication to the more real, to the more true, and to orienting and constructing a life around it.
But
yeah. And there's something, this is a little bit back to something we talked about earlier, was the jurisdictional arbitrage. Like people who want to deal with the hard truth rather than the uncomfortable, the comfortable lie, will like everyone will subdivide and split and try to find the community that that gives them their bias, right? So the cities or whoever it is, like where all the slumberers go, will basically aggregate, and then you'll have areas like Nevada. And what's funny is that like I feel like we're seeing like the beginning steps of this now. Like I feel like we're bifurcating in like a big way.
Totally.
Like, and as things get worse and worse, the courage and the balls to just say, just go fuck yourself is going to continue to increase. Like Texas just saying no to a federal law becomes more and more like likely as things move forward. And as, I mean, Jesus, like just, I mean, the Bitcoiner community is such a great example, is that like every few weeks people are just like peacing out to Texas. And I'm like, fuck you guys. Like I'm here in North, let's do something here. Come on, people, like come to North Carolina. But I think we're gonna see that. And like the Citadel thing is a meme, but the Citadel thing is fucking real. It is legit. Like, I mean, it's obviously not gonna look like some big towers with walls and all this shit, but like the idea of finding your tribe and the breakdown of the big tribe, like the cohesion of any sort of identity as a country, I think is dying. And we're going to have to redefine what it means to be a community and tackle all of these things that we've just left up to somebody else, particularly with our economy. Like, you know, Nevada, the situation there was that everybody was just kind of struggling. I think that's kind of what the reality now should be, in the sense that we're floating on this reserve currency. Like, we're not actually producing what we consume, like not even close. We're letting other people produce it for us. We were never able to sustain this. We were never able to sustain these salaries and this level of consumption. And the little thing breaks on my washing machine, and I just buy a new washing machine, even though it's actually $3 to fix the thing. You know, like it just wasn't sustainable. It's because we export paper. It's because we live in this illusion. We're kind of in the matrix. And we're gonna have to wake up to economic reality, and that's kind of what we're seeing unfolding. But yeah, I think like the bifurcation, the separation of all that, I think we'll see a lot of states just kind of like stand up and be like, we're not playing this game anymore. And I'm hoping, my fingers crossed, is that the federal government just has too much shit on its hands and dealing with too many things in too many different areas, that they just kind of like treat it like Nevada. You know, they're just kind of like, oh, you fucking crazy people, and like, I'll keep you at arm's length. I just got other things to deal with, and then just pretend it doesn't exist. You know?
Do you think that that's one of the unrealistic parts of this novel, is that there isn't more bifurcation? There isn't more, states basically splitting up? Because it's kind of weird that like it goes through such, like the federal government gets absolutely destroyed, but it's still pretty strong. I mean, besides Nevada in the novel, all the other states are still under its thumb.
Yeah, it probably is.
I mean, I think we're kind of seeing right now, like you could probably, like I could realistically point to 4 or 5 states that I think are pushing back continually, like more and more, and being willing to call out the embarrassments of the federal government. And when they do not align with the state, like particularly like the Midwest, like Central America, whatever, there's so much rural area out there. They are going to just be like, fuck all you people. Like, I don't care about any of this shit. Like we're not even selling our beef. We're not selling our beef. We're not selling anything that we farm. Just get the fuck out of here. Like, and they'll just play their own little game. And I think we'll be in this situation where a lot of the authority will have to pretend that these places don't exist. This is actually a lot of what's happening in South China. There are some very quote unquote free, like just not really under the Chinese communist thumb, societies, like parts of rural China that are really kind of on their own, because they're far enough away. And this is actually a lot of the source of their incredible productive capacity. So they just kind of pretend like it's not a problem, like it's like not a thing. And there are these like pretty serious black markets and these like gray financial markets in these areas, in these provinces. And like, I think that's the trend. I think that's where we're going. I think that's where a lot of the world is going. We're still looking at this overarching appearance of all of these big countries with big centers of control, and they're getting bigger and they're getting more totalitarian. But I think at the exact same time, there's a lot of small places that are hard to see, that are hard to pinpoint. They're kind of breaking away from this and just starting to play their own game. And I hope that this continues and accelerates. And we just kind of see this breakdown where it just kind of becomes irrelevant. Everybody kind of pretends. It's like king and queen. You know, it's like everybody still pretends they're important, but they're not really in charge anymore. You know, like kind of like the federal government. I almost hope like in like a 30-year, 40-year timeline, like the church used to be just the power, the authority. And one day the church just kind of became the church. It's still there, it's still big, it's still powerful, it's still got lots of control, still rape kids all the time, but it's not the one that runs society anymore. They're still they've lost their center of power. And I kind of think the large centralized governments are headed that way. And that's why they're getting extra desperate to grasp onto all of the control that they possibly can. We've got to have digital IDs. I think they're freaking out that they are losing control. They're certainly losing the narrative.
I think
At least that's what I see.
I was going to ask, do you think that it becomes like that gradual loss of power? Do they settle into being what they should be, which is effectively just ensuring property rights and having a military? Like, is that where we settle on, or is there continual overreach? Because is it okay if I mention the end of the book here?
Yeah.
I want to talk about it. It's one of my favorite things about the book.
Well, it was the best ending. Like they get to Nevada, they settle in, and then they jump forward one more time to like 2067 or something. They're like, in 2067, the 10% flat tax was increased to 11%. Of course. Like, and so like, I feel like this is, while it was a hilarious ending, it kind of gives a non-lesson in that, like, it's just like, well, everything's always fucked forever. It'll just take enough time to get there, and it'll just be a cycle over and over again.
Very fourth turning vibes.
Yeah. But I do think that in that instance, in a way, like Bitcoin has a hand in fixing that, and that hand in hand with jurisdictional arbitrage. And I think that there's something there, but like the ending, I had to smirk at that because it was such a perfect, like, oh yeah, we've got this, not even a utopia, but like a free part of the country, and we've set we have our base rules, and it'll be 10% flat forever. Well, now we're going to need an extra percent. Like it was perfect.
Yeah. Another thing about like, so the chip and CBDCs and digital ID, right? Same idea all the way down the line. And so there will be this like continuing effort to control more as things are falling apart, right? Of course. And part of that is going to be narrative control. And we see that all over the fucking place today, right? It's like this soup we swim in. You open up Twitter and that's basically all you see. But it is interesting. Like, did you guys remember in the movie V for Vendetta, like when Natalie Portman was locked up by V, and he kept like trying to get her to spill the beans on where he is, and she refuses, and it's all a big struggle, and then she just accepts like she's committed to this thing, she doesn't give a fuck what happens, and he's like, you're totally free, and she's all confused. She pushes open the door, she looks at the guards, they're mannequins, and she sees how fake her imprisonment was. And then the same thing happens to Willing, right? Like they're coming up to Nevada, and you hear all this story, like, oh my God, don't go there, your head will explode, there's landmines, there's like, massive walls, all this kind of shit. And they get there and they just drive right in, and they're like, are we in there now? And they're like, yeah, I think we're in here. And you get to the strip, and it's just, for me, it was a commentary on the difference between the narrative that's used to control and box people in versus the reality, because they don't have the resources to make the narrative real in all places for all people. As you guys were just saying, like, there's a ton of space in Montana and Wyoming and all these places. I mean, you can't, even as powerful and large as the state might be, they can't exert control everywhere. That's why the narrative control is so important, because you get people to, conform to your dictates voluntarily. And then they actually rock up on the scene and they find like, oh, this was complete, like it's a complete facade. And they just go in. Of course, like there's not even there's no troops on one side or the other, you know, it's because people, I guess people are blocking themselves in entirely voluntarily. And so there's no need. But I thought it was interesting because it kind of suggests like, oh, it's really easy to opt out. Like it's not as scary as you might think.
The narrative is so effective that they don't actually need enforcement of it. And I think if there's a single lesson to be taken away from the novel, that is the one. That is the most important one of the whole thing.
That's the one that stuck with me. The thing that like really hit me at the end that, you know, a year later, like when I think about the book, this is what I think about, is that perspective is that the most valuable thing the system had to control everyone was their fear that the system had total control. It was that there was nothing you could do against it, that there was no way out, that if you walked out, if you just stepped across the border, your head was going to explode. And that frame shift, like right after they got across, of just like, you know, I suddenly realized, like, I suddenly like can look at this thing again, and no longer is it this monolith of like godlike power. It's just like an ocean of just so much information that is so bloated, that is such a bad system that like they just don't even know how to handle all of it. They don't know what to do with it. Like it's just like the best they have are these like little like responses or whatnot, like and the things to keep you fearful. And that's like, you know, like from the context of like the CIA and conspiracy theories and all of these things. If I were the CIA, like if I were like an institution like that, it would be very beneficial to me to spread as many conspiracy theories about how fucking powerful and in control I am, you know, because I want people to think that I can do anything. And we're not just a bunch of, you know, bubbling idiots who target individuals when it's useful to target those individuals, but we're just running the show. This whole thing's just puppet. And we got all the strings.
It's a control on information, right? Like they didn't want any information getting out of Nevada, and then they were able, because they had a handle on that and preventing information from getting out, they could spin their own narrative all they wanted.
Well, it speaks again to the power of narrative, be it religious or government, fiat, dictate, or whatever. I mean, it's narrative. Even the stories we tell ourselves is basically our identity, right? Who are you? And you're like, oh, like narrative is just integral to how we see the world. And if you can co-opt that or control it to your own ends, it can be a very powerful thing, which again, I think is why so many Bitcoiners are like counter narrative, or at least abstaining, saying like, and this is to Matt's point before, it's like, what's the proper balance between understanding enough of the narratives that are trying to impinge upon your perspective so that you can mediate them properly versus total abstention and just, I don't believe anything, get the fuck away from me. And like, what is the proper balance to strike? And I think part of the reason we're all homies and we have discourse on Twitter and all that kind of stuff is because we're all trying to smash our perspectives together and figure out like what is the most optimal perspective to have in order to mediate the current circumstances that we're in.
I personally really enjoyed just the picture in my head of like the guy in Nevada, like sitting on his rocking chair. And he's just like, I just watched so many people just go through this narrative bullshit and just come out the other side and realize their head's not going to blow off.
Yeah. When they first go in, you know,
that's what I would do. I was just sit on the porch,
watch
all these people freak the fuck out.
But you know what, maybe Willing is to like the what we open with, maybe he is the Bitcoiner. Because you remember at the end when, Nolly had like her, I'm just going to say it, she had her gold and she was like, you know, what would you do with it? And I think, was it Jared who was just like, yeah, like had no real answer. And then Willing just went on like a rant about like having kids and building this and bringing the family together and doing all like rebuilding civilization basically was his answer. And she was like, that's a fucking answer I want to hear. It's yours, you know, go and do it, you know? So, and, you know, another last comment maybe about Willing was, I think, and not to, you know, no disclosures or pressure on anyone's medical choices here, but he was forced to get chipped. And he articulated how he felt he'd lost something when that happened to him. Like he had all this kind of spunk and pizzazz as a younger kid. And then when he was forced to get chipped because he needed it to work and be a part of the society, he felt like he was like neutered or I think he used the term rape, right? Like
Yeah.
He did. He specifically said rape.
Yeah. And he could now appreciate that word. And when people used to say it, and like over the last 2 years, how many times have people made that correlation between forced vaccination and, a feeling of losing your bodily autonomy, being raped, that kind of thing? And what does that take away from you? And I guess the answer is different for every single person. But for him in this story, like it was very disempowering. And then when he got to the free state, shortly thereafter, at I think great expense, he had his chip removed, and he commented how much it made him feel liberated again and feel like alive and strong. And I think his great aunt even commented like, you're back or something, like you're more vigorous again, or you're like the old Willing is back or something to that effect.
I mean, she was super prescient on that point because like, it wasn't even, I mean, you used the word forced. It was a soft pressure, right? Which is exactly what we saw in 2020, which is, do you want this job? Do you want to go to this restaurant? Do you want to shop at this store? Do you want to travel to this place?
Yeah.
Still your choice, but if you choose this, then most of your life goes away.
Yeah, you're destitute. So what kind of choice? I mean, it's straight up coercion, obviously. But yeah, I mean, it was exactly that. And I don't want to make this overly political, but I found it interesting in one of the interviews I listened to her. She voted for Biden in 2020, let's say, and I just like I'm not very politically involved. I don't think our solutions are political in nature, but just on the face of it, like to me, it seemed obvious at the time that with a Democrat in the White House, and given Trump's kind of behavior of like deregulating and that kind of stuff, like I felt it was somewhat obvious that you put a Democrat in there, you're going to get a lot more of the big spending, a lot more of the regulations, a lot more of the identity politics, a lot more of the taxation and that kind of stuff. And she rightly identified those things as being very dangerous in the book years earlier. But then when it came time in the real world to identify those threats, let's say, and potentially mitigate them, she went the other direction. And then, of course, in the interview that I listened to her, she was extremely regretful that she had, voted that way because she was extremely disappointed at how things had turned out. But I don't know. I found that to be an interesting.
I thought she did a pretty good job in the novel of like, I got the vibe that she was, she didn't identify with national political parties and that she was a relative free thinker. No, I think she did she did a decent job with it. I mean, she even has like the specific part in the book when they're talking about Jared, the guy who has Citadel or whatever, and saying that he was like a far left extremist, and then it just took like a little bit of the world to hit him to just turn him into a libertarian gun nut, and I thought she balanced it really well. And I think that made it a lot better because you could really ruin this novel if you were partisan on one side or the other.
Yeah, no, totally. I just, the policies that ruined what was happening in the book seemed to be more amenable to like a left sort of policy thing. Yeah.
She was specifically critical to the left, like in terms of the national politics, because it seems like the national politics were left dominant. Throughout the whole book.
Yeah, that was my impression for sure.
Yeah.
That's surprising me, John, that she voted for Biden, because I know she's written some fairly some articles on immigration specifically that I think a lot of people would consider very radical, not in that direction. So that's I find her, I think part of the reason this book is fascinating and she's fascinating is because she truly feels like kind of an outside perspective on a lot of this stuff. And I think she's still sort of beholden to, the like writer milieu. She lives in London. I'm sure she hangs around with I'd be curious to know what the social implications were of her writing this book, because like who in her little writer circle is going to be able to sort of appreciate this.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I know, she's been very critical of basically, I think what a lot of us would be critical on the last 2 years, the government overreach, the spending, the vax stuff. Like she's just been very vocal against all of that. And again, like in those circles that she, might ride in, like, what's it like to come up against that? Because like those circles are probably skew towards more sort of liberal stances on things. But again, I mean, this book, we're having this discussion at an interesting time because I don't want to be too hopeful about, change that's occurring because so much of it is happening right now. But you're getting a little bit of like pendulum swingy sort of vibes, are you not, these days? That like,
Yeah,
there's like some good developments seemingly happening. And now to the point about like Weimar and gold, and like maybe it's just a brief reprieve before the next absolute, egregious onslaught of things. But it might be the case that like books like this and conversations like this and everything that's been going on, like it's gone too far in one direction. And even those people that were formerly very gung-ho about the policies that have got us here are starting to, question whether or not they were the right policies. And then of course they're looking at other jurisdictions and other groups of people, Bitcoiners, Florida, Texas, whatever, and being like, it looks like it's like they're doing pretty good over there. So, maybe I need to reassess my stance on.
Look, I mean, I think it's good to be optimistic, and I think people like to hear optimistic takes.
But
so we tend to, especially public individuals, tend to lean towards optimistic because no one wants to hear a downer all the time. But my vote is clearly in the reprieve category, a temporary reprieve category. And I think she actually does a really good job about it in the novel in terms of Goog, which, by the way, one of my least favorite parts of the novel was just like the heavy handedness that she like named the two kids like Bing and Goog. Like no one in their right mind is going to name them after Google and Bing. But the like Goog is completely co-opted into the statism track, right? And that is something I see all the time. And I'm sure you guys see that all the time, specifically and with friends, like long-standing friends and family. I mean, we saw it through 2020 that are not in Bitcoin circles, where they justified and they try and justify, like he is literally at the end there, like he is ready to sick drones on, his family member that he's been through all of this shit with. He, for like 25 years, they went through like the worst of the worst and grew up together through all of that. And he was like, I am going to fuck you because you're not listening to these rules that the state is imposing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think there is, I think it's tough to see what the general sentiment of everyone is, because I think right now the pendulum had swung so far and there could very well be a reprieve for a number of years. But I do think that inside of the 2020s, we'll see a decisive start to swing back, maybe towards the end of the decade. But I see a lot from, there's still the extremes on one far side of the spectrum where it's like, let's bring back all of the mandates and stuff like that. The people that are just, they found solace in that overreach because they felt like somebody was doing something and they feel protected. But then I also have a fair number of friends who, went a little bit in that direction. And now I'm starting to see the cracks. I'm starting to see the, is it, do we need this anymore? Or is that take reasonable? Or is it okay to say, this doesn't make sense in all kinds of, whether it be socially or medically or whatever the issue may be? I'm starting to see those hints. And I think a lot of it can be underlying, like people think things, but they don't want to say it because they'll get canceled. And I think it's just a question of how much of a swell of that does it take for people to finally be vocal about it and move on it. So I don't know kind of where we're at, but I'm starting to see the inklings of people that previously said nothing, but now are starting to dip their toes into disagreement with the current thing.
Yeah, which is great. But to Matt's point about it potentially being a reprieve, like how, if it is just kind of like, aren't things kind of not right, then how much can they just step in with narrative, or how much can a little bit of narrative control bring them back into the fold and legitimize everything once again, right? And maybe that's why, we have that.
I mean, I think like as Bitcoiners are going to learn like a harsh lesson on this, because I mean, our federal government shut down small businesses. They're the most loved people in this country, and there was little pushback, and we're not that big of a community or that loved. Like, to turn the narrative on Bitcoiners is super easy. And what we see historically with government overreach, right, is kind of what we were talking about earlier with the grind, like this grind theory, which is they grind farther and farther and they take more and more. And then they give you like a slight reprieve that everyone gets to feel happy about. So like recently, like we all got to feel really happy that we don't have to wear masks on an airplane anymore, right? Like that 2 years ago, that would have been fucking ridiculous for people to be happy about. But we got that going for us. But meanwhile, I sold soccer tickets the other day because I got stuck in season tickets when I left New York that auto renewed. And I made a $3 profit, and Ticketmaster won't release it unless I file tax documents, which like I'm fine paying taxes on my $3, whatever. But like I got to go through that whole process and, fill out the privacy forms, dox myself completely to Ticketmaster, like upload my social security number and shit. And it's like, so they take all these other things behind the surface and then they give you one nice shiny thing that they just took away from you to begin with. And then they give that back to you. Right.
Yeah. And I think the other factor kind of pointing in the mass reprieve direction is just how unable the millennials and Gen Z are to establish self-sovereignty at this point. Like the number of millennials that can afford a house or, a lot of their own property. Those generations are so indebted and so disenfranchised from being able to live the kind of life that people have typically, in the past 60, 70 years, that I think they'll be much more amenable to narrative shift and control because they've got nothing else and they're kind of unmoored.
That's a very good point. And I agree. Maybe we should get CK, because he hands out the sovereign individual all over the place, right? Maybe we should get him to hand out the mandibles with it. Be like, if you don't do this, this is what you're going to get, right? It's one or the other.
I think the Mandibles is way more potent because I think everybody's snoozing by page 30 of the Sovereign Individual, but the Mandibles it's a narrative structure. It's
they're basically the same book. They're basically the same book, just one's written like a textbook, and then one is a nice, easy to digest fiction novel.
I think it's why Atlas Shrugged has the legacy that it has. It's fiction.
Yeah.
This goes back to the point right at the beginning, but whether it's like, we often say this with Bitcoin, right? But I think it's also the case with the unfolding events in this book is the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed, right? Like some people live in that circumstance right now. And the fact that prices at the grocery store just went up 20% over the last year has pushed way more people into that circumstance. And then people that were in that like intermediary bad circumstance has pushed them even further, right? And what's interesting about this book is like, it takes you along each frame of this grinding journey, right? So like you can really get a sense and an uncomfortable sense of like which or how each stage kind of feels. And, so we often use that phrase in reference to like, some of us are living, we've gone through the Bitcoin wormhole and we're living a deflationary life and things are better and relationships are good and wealth is growing and all that kind of stuff, which is great. And more people need to step through that wormhole. But for a lot of other people, like that is what the events in this book are not on the horizon. They're like super real right now. I mean, can you bring back up the same point basically, but can you even imagine what it's like when you see all these homeless people on the street in San Francisco and all that kind of stuff? It's like, it's not like they started out that way for most of them. It's not like, they had a childhood that was materially different from any of us, perhaps, like, had some friends, played on the street, went to school. And like, a series of life events or circumstances that you can't extricate yourself from. James, to your point just now about like the millennial generation, like if there's a pretty strong ceiling to like above which they're not going to have available to them, well, what like below that ceiling, what kind of emotions get stirred up, what kind of perspective gets generated, what kind of like value systems get constructed, and how much do they further skew that person toward bad outcomes versus good outcomes that would lead them up beyond that ceiling. And if that ceiling becomes more cemented, like harder steel instead of glass, how does the deprivation of hope, let's say, cause an acceleration of winding up in those circumstances whereby, holy shit, like I'm 37 years old and I'm sleeping in a tent on the side of the road, and I'm not one of those people. Like I'm a normal person, not a homeless person on the street. And the reality is there's no fucking difference. Like it's just series of events. And
how many of those were small business owners 2 years ago?
Exactly. So I get goosebumps now just saying it, because it's so like we just default to thinking like I'm a different person than them. Like that's not possible for me. And maybe, for us on this call, because we're so proactive in that domain, hopefully we'll all be able to avoid that outcome in life. But it's not like, there's a lot of circumstances that are not of your own choosing that you can't just flip on or off, no matter how, pragmatic or proactive you are. And, so a lot of those people were just victims of circumstance and fate. And others, I see it, the restaurant and small business thing is such a good example, because like you get ground down for 2 years. You're fighting as hard as you can. You've got debt. You were barely surviving before, like all this kind of stuff, expenses and everything. And then you end up being like, I can't do it anymore. And you give up. And then you can't find a job that's commensurate with your income level, or maybe if you can't even find a job that's sufficient to, keep up with your expenses. So you go into debt, you start doing the food stamp thing, and you rely on family members. And then if the broader circumstance or situation doesn't improve, then that's the grinding down. And then you find yourself, substituting hedonic adjustments all the way down until you're fucking eating, Cheerios for every single meal. And then, if an opportunity arises to take something when I'm in, my friend's house or the shopping mall or whatever, yeah, maybe I do it because it'll help feed my fucking kid. And who's not going to do that? And so like it's just, I guess it's just a commentary on how easy it is to think that like these are worlds apart and different people, when really like it's just life events, many of which are not of your own choosing, that could easily lead you down crazy roads. I mean, we could also make the analogy to like, Weimar Germany, where all those Germans, horrible people that just, were bloodthirsty and all that kind of stuff. Of course not. But victims of circumstance, victims of narrative, delusion, illusion, wishful thinking, all this stuff plays. And I think, again, that's why what brings us, so many of us, back to this idea of truth. Like that's the value of it. We're trying to orient ourselves most towards what is real, so that when we decide our behaviors in relation to that, we can optimize them for the outcome that we're hoping to achieve. And that's the end of my spiel there.
Yeah, I think what's so cathartic about reading this book for people like us is that, John, to your really good point, it is kind of a journey back to the real, back to truth. But what's equally terrifying about this book is just how ugly that path is. And, the visceral reminder all throughout the book of what it looks like and what happens. And it's really scary.
I think we all also, to that same point, we all know some googs in our lives. I definitely have friends that have very much manifested goog and his willingness to at all costs enact the desire of the state on their friends and family, and disown them if they choose not to, which that was one of the more aggravating parts of reading this book, because I know those people and there's more of them than there were in this book. It's more prevalent across people that I know than it was, because like Goog was like the standout, hey, I am the state, I am the one that's gonna come and ruin the party for the rest of you, or like, you know, make this horrible party worse than it already is. But so many people are too keen to jump into that role, and you know, near the end, or when there's the jump forward and he's well into his government job, and he comes in and everybody's just, you know, they don't have much to their name, so the dinner party isn't really much of a dinner party, and then he slams down a bottle of cognac, and you know, he's got the government perks of being in his position. And so again, it's this skew of, well, everybody needs to do their part, unless you're towing the line for the state, in which case you get a little bit of a kickback from that. So yeah, anyways, I was just wanted to highlight that I definitely was a little sad realizing that so many people would so willy-nilly just drop into that way of living.
Yeah. I mean, another thing I noticed with the book is something that we see all the time, which is after you got the chip, it's just like everyone just assumes they can hear everything, which is, we see that with the phones right now, where people just assume, they're like, I'm always being listened to. Like, I've already lost all my privacy. There's nothing worse I can give up. Which it just that one hit me really hard, because I just see it on a day-to-day basis. But one optimistic takeaway I would say is, first of all, her focus was mainly on New York City. We didn't see outside of New York City, which I personally loved, because I lived in New York City for a while. So I just like when things touch points that I'm aware of. But to me, like, this whole idea of Nevada is kind of a metaphor for how I kind of expect, at least on the longer term, for this stuff to play out, which is, you know, they get to Nevada and the guy says right away, he's like, you have no money. None of your money is worth anything here. You need to basically put in proof of work to have any value. And it is what you make of it. So it's not a utopia. It's not something that is perfect by any means. There's despair, there's hardship. But if you put in work, you will at least be able to operate under, you know, a fair wealth standard, a fair monetary standard. And that's kind of how I view, like, the most optimistic case pretty much for Bitcoin, which is there will be pockets of Nevada everywhere. And then outside of those pockets, there's going to be absolute despair and tragedy. And inside of those pockets, there will at least be ladders of a rung you can climb if you put the work in.
Hope.
Yeah. This is going to be the wake-up call for millennials and Gen Z. And everybody who has a, you know, women's studies degree, going back to the
or economists like the uncle,
or economists. Yeah.
I still can't believe how different a reading of this would be now versus like 2018. I mean, the experience of reading that book would just be it's like totally different, which is an interesting commentary on how the meaning and impact of books changes over time because the circumstance in which they're being read changes. You know, I wonder how much, you know, like pick a book you like Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, perhaps. Like, what's the impact of that book was it written in the 50s or 60s, I think? Like, how does that book read in the context of that time versus our time, after the 60s, after what, you know, research on psychedelics, after all this other literary work that came out as a result of that? You know, it's like meaning, and this is why a study of history is so difficult, because meaning changes so much over time. Like, you take a text from the 17th century and it's like, you know, it's profound in some way and it was popular at the time, but what does a reading of it in today's time with today's cultural framing and stuff, what meaning is conveyed? You know, I would assume that for most books, it's at least partially different. And for some, it's like tremendously different.
This is one of the reasons why I was really excited to have this conversation, because I really look forward to looking back on it in 5 years and seeing how much our opinions have changed on this book.
Yeah, there's something that stuck with me. I've heard this probably 1.5 million years ago, but it's something that always is like a frame of reference, a little grain of sand that stays with me all the time. is the idea that futuristic novels and science fiction and dystopias and like all of these things, we kind of have like this naive impression, like just consuming them, that they're about the future. And you realize when you actually read them, and particularly when you are in the future and you look back, that they're about today. They're about when they were written, is what the story is actually about. Like for instance, like all of the big budget like movies or whatever, the bad guy is literally a metaphor for climate change in all of them. And I feel like in 20 years, that's going to be like bullshit. We're going to look back and be like, oh my God, that's right. You know, but and that'll be fun to find out who was right and or wrong on that whole shebang. But it's a good example of like, we're getting into this weird space. Is like, this is what we see as the future. This is kind of like the hopelessness and the era that we're moving through, and it's becoming more and more obvious that this is some part of our future, that particularly Bitcoiners are waking up to the fact that there's a hell of a thing to deal with, like just on the horizon. Like there's a storm, there's a big ass storm. And we can pretend it's not there, and we can be apathetic and just say fuck all this stuff, but our whole job is to prepare and realize that the job of all this stuff, like we're not going to just be able to buy Bitcoin and ride the shit out. The whole point of Bitcoin is readjusting, is realigning us with the real world. Like the whole point of Bitcoin is to destroy the paper financing machine that took all our manufacturing away, that made certain like boots on the ground, dirty jobs unprofitable, undesirable, and made it so that everybody could think that all you have to do is have a women's studies degree and, you know, work in HR, and you're gonna cruise through life, when you're not actually producing anything for society. We have a multi-billion-dollar industry just to teach people, just to do people's taxes for them, just to fill out fucking paperwork.
Well,
Like,
and what's so cool about the book
that is a suck on society, you know? Like,
what I love about the book is that, you know, the women's studies thing, it's true, but it's like everybody kind of knows that. But I think not everybody realizes how meaningless so much of what people do, how completely virtualized, how like living in a spreadsheet for, you know, doing as a CPA for some startup that's doing Tinder for dogs, like how just completely misallocated that is and off the map it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the therapist one too was probably a big hit for a lot of people. You know, being a therapist, not being a job that people care about in a chaos situation. Economist obviously was an obvious one. I mean, she just hit so many different points. Once again, it's just that like we haven't even talked at all about that. She just nonchalantly talks about the majority of the workforce is mechanized. It's just, they call them ROBs, right? Like there's just these robots have taken a ton of menial jobs off the market.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, it will be, to I think everyone's points just now, like I think Guy, you said like people are writing about the future, but it's a commentary on the current time. Because if you asked 10 journalists or 10 economists or 10 of any sort of writer person, articulate our current time, you'd probably get a pretty large variety, like pretty divergent characterizations of like what our world looks like today, or even what the country looks like, or what even a certain subculture looks like. And then it's borne out through the course of history which one was most accurate, like which perception was the most clear. And perhaps, you know, that's how history gets at least partially studied, is like it becomes evident which accounts were the most accurate and they become the most credible and that kind of stuff. But yeah, it will be interesting to see, you know, how this book stands up over the course of time, and if her assessment of things holds up. I mean, obviously we think it will to a certain degree. And I want to add that, you know, a lot has been made of the whole money is stored energy. That phrase was actually in the book as well. I don't know if you guys caught that, but I'm not sure if it was Lowell or Willing or one of them. But, you know, when I read it, I thought of our friend Michael Saylor, of course.
What's amazing about that book is that no character is a straw man. Even, you know, the economists on the other side who are representing, say, the Keynesian or the MMT, like they're articulate. I think they do a good job of representing the true points. She just did such an incredible job of emulating the different perspectives and really, illustrating them.
I agree. Last one for me, because I'm sure everyone's got stuff to do, but what did you guys think? And again, this is a big spoiler, but when Douglas they were sitting around the campfire, like right when they were heading out of town, and blew his wife away and then blew himself away. That was pretty abrupt and shocking to me.
I mean, it pretty much caps off the first half of the book, right? Like it's right.
But he was always so chill and okay with things. And you can just imagine him sitting around there and being like, oh, well, this is clearly the most reasonable, rational thing to do in this situation. We're just going to be a drag on them. We might foil the whole plan. So, okay. Bang, bang, problem solved. I mean,
I appreciated, he was always a character that very much, seemed very personal responsibility forward. Didn't like people taking care of him. And obviously there was a responsibility there on him to do that, because no one else had the heart to do that. But I do like the little added bonus that he taught him how to use the gun before he did it as well, which was I passed down this personal responsibility to you, and now I'm going to take the ultimate form of personal responsibility.
And this whole book, I feel like really embodies the lesson of what we've talked about in this, is that, everything is a trend. Like the big movements and the big shifts don't really matter. They're usually the culmination after the trend has moved in that direction for a very, very long time, very quietly, very slowly. Every big thing in the world happens after 10,000 tiny incremental movements that way. And this is kind of like the loss and the final flood of nihilism of that character, like the final giving up of, trying to take responsibility throughout the whole thing. And then basically just like the hope, just when it finally crashes, it just crashes completely. And it's just time to cut the fucking lights off and just be done with that. It's one of those things that, the same thing that you see happening in society, where horrible events occur just because we just took that one turn in the wrong direction and just incrementally went further and further and further, and we never figured out how to stop and just start moving back in the opposite direction. That you have the same thing happening internally too in every individual, that they get further and further from truth, they get further and further from meaning and anything in their life that they can actually hope for or hang on to. And it's also why I think like being pessimistic, whether or not it's realistic, optimism is the only path, because pessimism leads you down. Like you can be realistic and optimistic. There's no value in expecting things are going to get to worse to the point that you can't do anything about it. Like the best thing you can do is do what you can do. Like that's it. And keep fight the increment and see if you can't get 1%. You can't beat just the incremental thing in the wrong direction and get 1% in the other. And on a long enough timeline, you win. But you just have to fucking keep going, and you have to believe that at the end of this, it's not going to be so fucking bad. We're going to figure something out. Society does shift back. It just does. And I think we're in a better position. Look at the narrative breaking down. It is happening. More people are talking about this, and we are openly ridiculing the authorities that are not supposed to be questioned in a hilarious and meme-worthy fashion with hundreds of thousands of tweets and retweets in real time. That is a sign of good, in my opinion. Even when it completely fails and it's for a stupid reason, just the sheer fact that we can ridicule them and lower their importance means that we are just so slightly, even if it's just at a mental level, less dependent on their version of the world. And I think I hope that's our goal. I hope that's our mission is just fight the increment. Just fight the increment and believe whether it's realistic or not, I think it is realistic. I'm a rational optimist, I like to think, but shit is going to get better. Shit is going to get better. And the only way that it does is if we believe it's going to get better and we therefore work for it. You know, work and
Well
building
said.
is the only thing that gets us there. So
Well said. I think it also could be and first of all, I mean, how that whole dynamic of people being able to speak their mind on Twitter, I mean, how lit is that about to get with Elon taking over Twitter? And like, what is the discourse going to look like when there's presumably going to be less censorship of stuff? Like it could get pretty wild. But no, I totally agree with your point, Guy. My, like, I guess closing remark is like, there's so many instances and moments in my life today that are outstanding, like just couldn't get any better. And so it's like we were saying before about a spectrum of things, like it's already fucking incredible on sometimes, right? And maybe that's 1% of the time, or maybe that's 50% of the time. But like, there's a bunch of things you can't control, and there's a bunch of things that you have some influence on and maybe some control over, right? So like, is not your task to simply try to improve those things that you have control over. And then there has to be some degree of acceptance for the things that you legitimately cannot change, right? And I think that acceptance delivers some type of a peace, you know, even if you would still lament the outcomes of those things that you can't control. But I think, you know, like as we shift into you know, a transition, and if it is going to get kind of, you know, messy over the intervening 5 or 10 years, like I think we have to, or I try to remember not to, like, if I doom scroll on Twitter for too long and I come away with like a sour mood that things are so fucked, I try to remember that that is just a frame, and that is just a slice of what's happening. And there's a lot of other incredible shit that counterbalances that. And I try to place my focus there and amplify those things rather than, you know, getting upset about the absolute retarded stuff that I can't really control. So that's my final words. You guys, any last words before we shut it down?
I just want to see more, to be honest, I'd like to see more fiction that fits into kind of the ethos that a lot of us
Bitcoin fiction
align with.
I agree.
I did meet a really cool guy down when I was in Costa Rica, a Canadian expat. And he's in the midst of writing some Bitcoin based fiction, but like,
is that what you gave me?
That's
I
what
read it.
Oh, did you?
I read it. That was fun. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm excited for him to do some stuff, but I'd love to see some more, even just on a you know, the lessons taught therein are tangentially. I'm mincing my words here. Sorry, but you know, like can be kind of related back to Bitcoin.
I think there's going to be an explosion of that kind of stuff. I really do. Because I mean, if this is as meaningful to us all as it's seeming to be, I think it's just going to inspire that stuff, not just fiction. It'll inspire philosophical writing, it'll inspire work of various kinds, but it just seems like it's going to inspire like an explosion of creation, basically.
I mean, I just want to thanks, John, for hosting us. I think it is an important conversation. And just so to people listening to this, you know, get your shit in order. No one's going to get your shit in order for you. And, you know, so I think personally, I think the power of the individual is extremely powerful, both for the individual, but at scale, if we're all aligned, we can make real actionable change. Real things can change for the better. And I just want to second, you know, what Guy said, which is basically this idea of like pragmatic optimism. Unfortunately, I think that for the majority of people, they're going to need to get absolutely burned before they do anything. But that doesn't mean that we can't be optimistic for the future. It doesn't mean that we can't make real beneficial change, both in the short term, medium term, and long term.
Totally.
Yeah, I'll leave it.
James, you got anything? Guy?
Thanks to you, John, for putting this together. I love the book, and I just think it totally exemplifies what one path in front of us could look like in terms of moving away from the virtual and back to the real. And I think we've got some wild shit ahead of us. So get ready to ride that out. But thanks again, John.
Yeah.
Yeehaw.
Yeah, I'll close it out just with same thing. Thanks. This was a really cool book for me. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of fiction. I kind of go back and forth, and I can probably consume like 3 or 4 books a month. Like Audible gets so much of my money. And but I'm also really try to be an optimist. You know, like every terrible thing that has happened in society, we came out the other side. You know, it's not
We're
like
still here.
humanity is dead yet. Like we're still here. And it is a cycle. And you know, there's also a degree of, you know, like, be happy with the responsibility. Is that, like, I feel I'm competent. Like I feel like, I mean, I fuck up all the time, but like I don't trust letting somebody else take care of it for me. You know, like if there was ever a time that we could live through, would Bitcoiners really be happy if everything was boring and there was no challenge here? You know, like it isn't this where you find meaning, is when shit falls apart and you figure out what you actually needed to build and what was actually important that we lost. Like that's where meaning comes from. Like when everything's great, you know, nothing matters, you know. And I also agree with Sessions over there, is the idea of narrative. Is as I feel like Bitcoin is really missing that. And if I get off my ass, I've got a really fun little story that I want to finish. And hopefully that will be something sooner rather than later. But write story. And something that I would tell myself is be afraid to write a bad story so that you can try to get a good story. You know, like probably my biggest thing is insecurity about like finishing it and letting somebody else read it. It's really easy to be a vague idea. But yeah, you know, revel in the fact that we get to be the generation that takes the responsibility and fixes shit. Because I think we got a chance of doing it.
Beautifully said. And I love how fuck you money is giving so many people the confidence where perhaps it didn't exist before to express themselves in whatever way, writing stories, entrepreneurship, speaking their mind, doing shit online, like just getting it out there and being okay with, you know, that and the feedback that comes, and trying to further understanding or refine a perspective as a result of doing that. So gents, I appreciate the time. It was awesome to see you all in Miami recently, and I hope we get to see each other again soon. So take care. Talk soon.
Cheers.
Oh, yeah, man. Thanks, dude.
Peace.